The morning Harlan Dupree walked into Meridian Trust Bank, he was wearing the same jacket he wore to his daughter's graduation. The one with the small burn mark on the left cuff from a welding accident 12 years ago. He hadn't thought to change it. Why would he? He was just there to make a deposit. He never made it past the lobby. Now, before we get into what happened next, if this is your first time here on Lineage Tales, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because the stories we tell here, they're the ones that stay with you. Harlan Dupree had worked the same stretch of land in Talbot County, Georgia, for 31 years. 240 acres his father had left him. Not much to look at from the road. Red clay soil, old fence posts, a barn that needed a new roof every decade or so. But beneath that unremarkable surface, Dupree had built something most people in that county only dreamed about. He'd started with soybeans. Moved into timber rights on the back 40 when lumber prices climbed in the late 90s. Then, quietly, over the span of 2 decades, he'd acquired adjacent parcels whenever neighbors sold. Sometimes out of necessity. Sometimes just because Harlan was the only one who showed up with a fair offer and no games. By 2019, his operation had expanded to include a small cattle rotation and a contract with a regional produce distributor that brought in consistent revenue year-round. He wasn't rich in the way that word gets thrown around on television, but he was stable. Quietly, stubbornly, impressively stable. His daughter, Renee, had finished her MBA at Georgia State the previous spring. His son, Elliot, was finishing an engineering degree in Alabama. Harlan had paid for both of them, not with loans, not with assistance, out of what he'd built in that red clay soil. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck because he saw no reason to drive anything else. That was the man who walked into Meridian Trust Bank on a Thursday morning in March. The branch manager at Meridian Trust was a man named Clifton Baird, 43 years old. He'd been running that particular branch for 6 years, long enough to feel comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable, in his own judgment about people. He had a way of sizing someone up in the first 10 seconds that he'd probably never admit to himself, but that everybody who worked under him noticed. Harlan walked up to the front desk and explained that he was there to speak with someone about a large cash deposit and potentially opening a business account for his agricultural operation. The woman at the desk, whose name tag said Tricia, smiled politely and said she'd let the manager know. Clifton Baird came out from his office, looked at Harlan. The worn jacket, the calloused hands, the work boots that hadn't been polished since the last time someone asked him to a formal occasion, and made a decision in those first 10 seconds. He asked Harlan if he had an appointment. Harlan said no, but that he'd been a personal account holder at this branch for over 20 years and had simply stopped in to discuss a business matter. Clifton said they were quite busy, and that for business account inquiries, they preferred scheduled appointments. Harlan said that was fine, he'd be happy to schedule one, but that while he was here, he had a cash deposit to make. Clifton said the tellers could handle that. Harlan nodded and walked to the teller line. This is where it gets uncomfortable to tell. The teller, a young man named Devon, who, by all accounts, was just doing what he thought he was supposed to do, flagged the transaction when Harlan slid over an envelope containing $47,000 in cash. Now, cash deposits above $10,000 trigger standard federal reporting requirements. That's normal. That happens every day in every bank in this country. What is not standard is what happened next. Clifton Baird came back out of his office and asked Harlan to step to the side. He said, in a low voice, that the amount of cash was unusual, and that before they could process it, they needed to verify the source of funds. Harlan said that was fine. He was happy to provide documentation. He had it with him, copies of his last 3 produce contracts, his most recent tax return, and a letter from his accountant. He'd brought them specifically because he knew large cash deposits could require documentation. Clifton looked at the papers. Then he looked at Harlan. Then he said he was going to need to make a call before they could proceed. He stepped away. Harlan stood at that counter for 45 minutes. People came in behind him and were new teller windows opened. A woman who'd arrived 15 minutes after Harlan was taken into a private office for a business account consultation. Harlan stood at the counter. When Clifton finally returned, he said there had been a compliance concern and that the branch would not be able to process the deposit at this time. He said Harlan was welcome to submit his documentation for review and that someone would contact him within 7 to 10 business days. 7 to 10 business days. To deposit his own money. Harlan picked up his envelope. He picked up his documentation. He said very quietly, "I'd like the name of your regional compliance officer, please." Clifton said that information was on the bank's website. Harlan said, "I'd like you to write it down for me." Clifton wrote it down. Harlan folded the paper, put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, the one with the burn mark on the cuff, and walked out. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be, drop a 1 in the comments. Because Harlan had been in that bank for over 2 decades. He'd never missed a payment, never had a complaint filed. His personal account had maintained an average balance that would have surprised Clifton Baird considerably if he'd bothered to look it up before he made those 10-second decisions. But he hadn't looked it up. That was the mistake. What Clifton Baird did not know, what very few people in that county knew, because Harlan Dupree was not a man who announced himself, was that 3 months earlier, Harlan had finalized the sale of the timber rights to the back portion of his property to a regional development consortium. The sale had cleared for $1.2 million. The $47,000 in that envelope was a fraction of what was sitting in accounts that Clifton's branch didn't even know about. Harlan didn't go home and stew. That wasn't his way. Instead, he drove the 14 miles back to his property, sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and called his daughter. Harlan Dupree was 26 years old, 8 months out of her MBA program, and working at a consulting firm in Atlanta that specialized in financial compliance. She had chosen that field specifically because, growing up, she'd watched her father navigate systems that seemed designed to make things harder for people who looked like him. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Harlan finished, there was a brief silence. Then she said, "Daddy, did you get the manager's name?" He had. "Did you get the teller's name?" He had. "Did you write down the time you arrived and the time you left?" He had. She said, "Okay. Don't go back there yet. Give me a few days." Renee knew the regulatory landscape around banking and discriminated between the way her father knew the difference between soil that would hold water and soil that wouldn't. She knew that what had happened to Harlan had a name. Several names, depending on which statute you applied. She also knew that what mattered wasn't just what happened. It was what could be documented and demonstrated. She spent the first day building a timeline. She pulled Harlan's account history at Meridian Trust. 23 years, no delinquencies, consistent deposits, no flags. She requested, through proper channels, a copy of the branch's standard operating procedure for large cash deposits. She documented the 45-minute wait time. She noted that other customers had been served during that period. She reached out to a college friend, a woman named Sasha Ingram, who was now an attorney at a civil rights firm in Savannah. Sasha had handled 3 Fair Housing Act cases in the past 2 years and had been quietly expanding into banking discrimination. She listened to Renee's summary and said she wanted to see the documentation before she said anything definitive, but that what Renee was describing sounded like it met the threshold for a formal complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and potentially the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. She also said it sounded like it met the threshold for a lawsuit. On the 3rd day, Renee drove down from Atlanta. She sat at that same kitchen table with her father and laid out what she'd compiled. Harlan looked at it for a long time. He wasn't a man who showed a lot of emotion on his face, but something shifted in his expression when he saw his own 23 years of loyalty to that branch reduced to a timeline that showed, plainly and without exaggeration, what had been done to him. He said, "What do we do first?" Renee said, "We go back to the bank, together, and we make a second attempt to deposit the funds, documented. And if they refuse again, we have everything we need." They walked into Meridian Trust on a Tuesday morning. Renee was in a suit. She was carrying a leather portfolio. Harlan was wearing the same jacket. Tricia was at the front desk again. Renee asked to speak with the branch manager. When Clifton Baird came out, she introduced herself, full name, her firm, her title, and said that she was accompanying her father, Harlan Dupree, who was a 23-year account holder at this branch, to make a deposit that had been refused on the previous Thursday. She placed a letter on the desk. The letter, on her firm's letterhead, outlined the timeline of the previous visit, cited the relevant sections of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act as they pertained to banking services, noted that the refusal had occurred while other customers were served without similar scrutiny, and stated that this second attempt was being documented as part of an ongoing review. Clifton Baird read the letter. His face went through several changes that were difficult to describe precisely. He said he'd need a moment. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he was accompanied by a woman Harlan had never seen before. A woman named Gloria Tate, who introduced herself as the branch's compliance officer. She apologized for the experience on Thursday. She said the deposit would be processed today without any further delay. She said the bank took these matters seriously. The deposit was processed in 4 minutes. Harlan said thank you in the same tone of voice he used for everything. Renee said nothing. She just made a note in her portfolio. They walked out. In the parking lot, Harlan stopped by his truck and looked out at the road for a moment. Renee stood beside him. He said, "That's not the end of it, is it?" She said, "No, sir, it's not." The formal complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was filed that same week. Sasha Ingram's firm submitted additional documentation to the OCC. Together, they compiled a pattern analysis. Because what had happened to Harlan was not, it turned out, an isolated incident at that branch. 3 other individuals had reported similar experiences at Meridian Trust's Talbot County location in the preceding 18 months. One was a retired schoolteacher named Alva Grissom, who had been questioned for over an hour when she came in to inquire about a CD for her grandchildren's education fund. One was a contractor named Warren Elias, who had been told his documentation was insufficient when he tried to open a business checking account. Documentation that Sasha confirmed met every standard requirement. The third had not filed a complaint, but had mentioned the experience to a community group, where it had been recorded in meeting minutes. Sasha called that a pattern. Federal regulators agreed. The investigation that followed was not fast. These things never are. It took 14 months. During that time, Clifton Baird was placed on administrative leave, which the bank described as unrelated to the investigation, which nobody believed. The branch underwent a full compliance audit. 3 additional staff members were interviewed. What that process found, and what was later summarized in the regulatory finding, was that the branch had applied inconsistent standards for large cash deposit documentation in a manner that disproportionately affected black customers. The finding used careful, measured language, the kind that regulators use when they want to be precise without being dramatic. But the meaning was not subtle. The bank settled. The terms were not fully public, but the portions that were included a mandatory retraining program for all branch staff, a third-party compliance monitor placed at the branch for 2 years, and individual settlements with each of the 4 complainants. Harlan's portion of the settlement was not something he talked about publicly. He was not a man who talked about money publicly. What he did talk about, at a community meeting at the First Baptist Church 3 weeks after the settlement was announced, was the importance of documentation. He stood up in front of about 60 people, farmers, small business owners, teachers, retirees, and said something that Renee later told people she wished she'd recorded. He said, "They count on you being too tired to fight. They count on you not writing things down. They count on you not knowing what you're owed. So write things down. Know what you're owed. And when you're tired, find somebody who isn't tired yet." The room was quiet for a moment after that. Then someone in the back started clapping, and it moved forward through the room like something that had been waiting for a place to land. Clifton Baird left the bank 9 months after the investigation concluded. The official reason given was pursuing other opportunities, the phrase companies use when neither side wants to say the other thing out loud. He relocated out of the county. People who knew him said he seemed diminished somehow, like something in him had recalibrated and not settled back into place. Gloria Tate, the compliance officer, who had apologized to Harlan that Tuesday morning, later gave a deposition in which she stated that she had raised concerns about inconsistent practices at the branch on 2 separate occasions before the complaint was filed, and that those concerns had not been acted upon. That deposition became part of the public record. Renee left her consulting firm the following year and joined Sasha Ingram's practice in Savannah. She told her father she felt like she'd found the work she was actually supposed to be doing. Harlan said he'd suspected as much since she was about 14 years old. Alva Grissom, the retired teacher, used part of her settlement to set up the CD she'd originally gone into the bank to establish. It was for her granddaughter, who, at last count, had decided she wanted to study law. Warren Elias expanded his contracting business and opened a business checking account at a different bank, one whose manager met him at the door with a handshake. Harlan kept the paper that Clifton Baird had written on, the name of the regional compliance officer, the one Harlan had asked him to write down while standing at that counter. He kept it in the same drawer where he kept his property deed, his children's birth certificates, and the last letter his father had written him before he passed. He didn't frame it. He didn't show it to people. He just kept it, the way you keep a thing that meant something at a moment that required you to know who you were. He also kept the jacket, the one with the burn mark on the cuff. Some things you don't retire just because the fight is over. Some things you keep because they remind you what the fight cost and what it was worth. And because the next time someone looks at you in those first 10 seconds and decides they already know what you are, you want to remember that you've been here before, that you stood your ground, and that the ground held. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. We'll see you in the next one.